Hi guys, so I'm going to talk about editing. Now, I'm going to be specifically talking about editing a novel, but this would apply to any number of different kinds of work. So editing really starts long before you ever pen the first word of your book. So it starts with the inception of your idea, whatever your book idea might be, and then you carry it all the way through to publishing, and maybe even sometimes after publishing if you miss something in your book that you have to go back and revise and publish a later edition of your book or something like that. So I'm going to talk about 5 different kinds of editing, and then I'm going to talk about how you can do some of these on your own. So the first kind of editing I want to talk about is developmental editing. And developmental editing, briefly defined, is basically structural editing. It's basically taking your book and arranging the content, arranging the ideas to make sure that the big picture of your work actually makes sense. It's presented in a way that is readable and that folks are going to be able to follow and understand. So one of the easiest ways to get started with developmental editing is just to create an outline. So pretty much every novel I write starts with this. I don't leave it there. The reason why is because novels are very complex. They're not just something that you can create an outline and then write. That might work well for essays, but novels have a lot of layers to them. They have the plot, they have characters, they have settings. You have to figure out how you're going to go from the inciting incident to the climax to the resolution, and then you have plot twists. And then you have to weave in character arcs and all of that stuff into the novel itself. So there's a lot of intricacies there, but an outline's a good place to start just to get some ideas down, and then you can kind of expand on it from there. I'm not going to be talking about that in this particular video, but I will be doing one on this specific topic in the future. So the second kind of editing that you want to do is substantive editing. Now, developmental editing, as I said, really starts before you ever start penning your work. Substantive editing begins whenever you've written something, while you're writing it, and after you've finished the manuscript and you're going more into an editing phase. Substantive editing is something that you want to keep at the forefront of your mind as you write, because when you start to write, you're going to be wanting to get your novel done or your manuscript finished, but you really need to be critical of the progress that you're making on the novel or the work that you're trying to complete. Now, depending on how you write, depends on how this is going to work out. Now, I'm the kind of guy that likes to start with chapter 1 and write to the end of the book and not skip around. Some folks like to skip around where they write the beginning, the end, and then kind of fill in the middle. It just really depends on who you are and what your nature is. However, regardless of what order you write in, you're going to be mindful of what you're actually writing. The reason you want to be mindful is because whatever you're writing in the current context is going to impact the overall structure and flow of your book. So if you're writing a section and you've been dragging that on for far too long, then it may be that you need to go back and either remove some things or insert new content that will make the action move forward. What you don't want to end up with is too much action or not enough action. You want it to be fairly good pacing throughout your novel so that you kind of have a building up to the climax without a lot of dead space in the middle. A few things to look out for are things like info dumping, which is where you just have long sections of exposition about the world. That can be a little boring and your readers are probably not going to remember it anyway. Present that as relevant, but just explaining everything about your world, either in just prose or through the lens of a character, can be a little bit arduous. I actually did this in my first novel, and I was a little cheeky about it in the way I smuggled it in. And looking back, it was probably not something I should have done, but in any case, it's in there, and I'm not exactly proud of that. But you live and learn. In my subsequent novels, I've learned not to do that, and now I try to weave in the world building experience as it unfolds, rather than just having these long expositions of info dumping. Something else might be mindless dialogue, stuff that doesn't really talk about what's at hand. This would be like they're talking about the weather, or they're talking about stuff that's completely irrelevant to the story at hand. Some of that you can introduce just to kind of break the ice in a conversation, but don't spend a lot of time on it. Other things would be like overly descriptive passages about the way your character is dressed or what they're doing. You can say they brush their teeth. You don't need to sit there and describe how they brush teeth, or you can say they took a shower. You don't need to describe all the intricate details of everything that goes into taking a shower, but you get the point. You're just really trying to talk about the actions they do and let the reader's imagination kind of fill in the details, but kind of just alluding to those kinds of things to set the scene or to describe the action is going to be more than sufficient to describe things in your novel. Now, beyond just the mere content, you might also want to make sure that what you're writing also fits into the thematic content of your novel as well. Are your character arcs making sense? Are the characters growing? Is there conflict that's evolving? Is it growing? Is it being resolved? Are there themes that you're trying to write about in your book that you're exploring through the actions and the lens of the characters as they interact with the world and one another? All of these things are important to make sure that you're including in your writing. If you're not doing these things, then it's probably not moving the plot of your story along, and you're just having a lot of dead space in your work. So the next three that I'm going to be talking about are getting down into the weeds, and these are really going to be focusing on the actual way that language is expressed. Now, the first two are talking more about the substantive characteristics of a work. These last three are going to be talking more about the nuts and bolts of how that's expressed and the language that you're going to be writing. So the next kind of editing is line editing. And line editing is where you're really looking at it line by line, and you're going through the details of the manuscript line at a time, looking at the paragraph and at the sentence level. So one thing I like to do with line editing is listen to my work being read aloud. And I use the text-to-speech engine inside of Microsoft Word. In addition to catching a lot of other issues, line editing in this case lets me hear it. And that allows me to listen for things like monotonous passages. So if I have a lot of sentence structures that are kind of similar to one another, that can be very monotonous in the presentation. So I might go back and restructure some of that. Sometimes the transitions between different paragraphs can be a little bit rough. So I might want to add some kind of transition or edit for transitions. Another time you might have a long sentence that's hard to understand. You might want to break that up into a bunch of smaller sentences so that they will be easy to read. Sometimes you might have a bunch of sentences that are kind of small that you can kind of combine either with a compound subject or a compound predicate, and that would actually make your work more readable. Sometimes you might need to enter transition words or omit transition words, whatever it might be. A lot of the times line editing gets down into those sentence details where you're trying to make it read smoothly and read so that you can understand it without having to kind of sit there and read it 2 or 3 times just to kind of get the gist of what is going on. So the next kind of editing is copy editing. And copy editing is where you're actually looking at the word choices and you're looking at some of the phrases that you're going to be using in your work. Now, some of the things to look for here would be better options for verbs. And the verbs are very important in writing because that's what expresses your action. So sometimes we have a tendency to use weaker verbs, but sometimes you might be able to get away with a synonym that's a stronger verb. Instead of he walked, you can say he ambled or he sauntered, or sometimes you can say he ran, you could say he dashed or he sprinted. And those would indicate a quick burst versus just kind of, whether they're jogging or maybe they are sprinting. I don't know. But a sprint is very specific and running is more general. So you might be able to come up with better words like that inside of your writing. Another thing to look out for is ambiguity in some of your pronouns. Sometimes you might end up writing a passage where you say she did this, she did that, she did this, she did that, she went over there, she got this, and you forget to go back and address what you're actually talking about with that pronoun. Now, this is something that ends up happening a lot in prose because if you're writing about a single character that's going through some kind of process or doing some kind of experience, that tends to happen a lot whenever you're just dealing with that kind of character. If you have multiple characters, it's usually not a big deal. What you can do to kind of compensate for this is use the character's name, talk about their position, are they the daughter of another character or are they a teacher? What is their role? Are they a person that has a particular job? You can use the job title or something like that. And you can mix up the name with the pronoun and some other words that are descriptive in the writing so that you're always talking about the same person, but you're not using the same word over and over and over again to describe that person. Another thing to watch out for in this particular kind of editing is crutch words. And our crutch word is a word that you use over and over and over in your writing. And my crutch word is went. For some reason, I use this word all over the place. And even despite my best efforts to avoid it, I still do it. And I have to go back when I'm reading my work to replace went with better verbs. And I just use that verb for some reason when I'm writing. It's just so baked into my psyche that even though I try to break the habit, I can't do it. I've mitigated it quite a bit in my more recent writing, but still I do it. And so in my copy editing process, I always look for my crutch word and then I go back and remove it or edit it out with better verbs. And I try to restructure my sentences so that I'm not using my crutch word as much. Now, another thing to look out for is passive voice. Now, passive voice is where your subject receives the action. He was hit by the ball. Now, you could replace that sentence with the ball hit him. In that case, the ball is the subject and it is hitting the object, him. And just by restructuring the sentence, you can fix that a lot of the time. But it's usually not as punchy as writing whenever you're using passive voice. So you generally want to have active voice where you have the subject performing the action rather than the subject receiving the action. So the last one I want to talk about is proofreading. Now, proofreading is just the mechanics of writing, so making sure that you don't have spelling errors, that you have correct punctuation and that kind of thing. So the mechanics of writing is all that stuff that we learn at a very young age in grade school. It's the appropriate use of commas, the appropriate use of capitalization, making sure that you use the appropriate word, looking out for homophones, all of these different kinds of things that are just very mechanical in nature. Also included in proofreading is making sure that the formatting is correct. So if you have a specific style that you're aiming for, making sure that you're conforming to that particular form is going to be important as part of proofreading as well. Now, for novels, you kind of get to decide what that form is going to be. If you're doing more professional writing, you might be writing to a given standard like MLA or AMA, whatever it might be. But whatever it is, the proofreading context is going to be where you're going to be just looking at the document and looking for any of those kinds of mistakes and then correcting those. Those are usually very easy to fix and usually harder to catch. Some easy ones to catch are things like capitalization issues, punctuation at the end of his sentence, and spelling issues. And a lot of the times the word processor is going to be able to fix these for you, and they will automatically do it. If you forget to capitalize the first letter of a word at the beginning of a sentence, it'll do it for you. Sometimes if you forget a period, it'll say, hey, you need a period right here. Those kinds of things. Those are usually easy to catch and fix. Some less obvious ones are things like homophones. Homophones are a terrible bane for me because I don't really think in terms of spelling. I think in terms of sound. So I tend to use words like RODE when I'm talking about ROAD, and vice versa. If I'm talking about riding a horse, he rode down the road, I might end up using those in the wrong context or the wrong way, whatever I'm writing. And the word processor isn't always going to be able to pick up on those for you. It'll correct misspellings of those, but it won't tell you which is the appropriate one to use and when not to use. Now, sometimes if you're using some tools like grammar checkers, it can kind of pick up on those things, but not in every case. One of the harder things to work with is commas. Now, commas are one of those things that even experienced writers struggle with, and I know new writers do. Sometimes the rule of thumb is when in doubt, leave it out. However, there are appropriate times to use commas, such as compound sentences or dependent phrases, and there are times that you shouldn't use them, such as comma splices, which is where you have a comma where you need a period. Now, there are tools that can help you with this. However, the tools are not foolproof. So you just have to learn kind of by experience. So what you might want to do is pick up a lot of works and read them. Pay attention to the way that more experienced authors are using the commas. Pay attention to the way that your software is going to correct your mistakes in your commas, and then learn from your mistakes and then apply those as you write. And you'll get more used to figuring out when you should and should not use commas. As I said out of the gate, the editing process is something you start before you ever start writing. And again, start with developmental editing, and then you start with substantive editing after you start writing. Now, these typically two go together. The reason why is as you write your work, you're going to be try to frame out your structure. And now once I finish my manuscript and I've kind of got it to the place I want the story to be, then I'll kind of transition to a phase where I focus in on this kind of editing. And this process, I typically do a couple of different things here. First, I will listen to it being read aloud by the computer. And then I will run it through some software like Grammarly and ProWritingAid, and then I'll work through some of their suggestions on line editing, copy editing, and proofreading. And then after I've done it through the software, go back and read it again a few more times to make sure that it still reads well. Now, typically after I've done that, I'll pass it off to my beta readers. And even after doing all that work, my beta readers inevitably will still find issues. Getting a second set of eyes on it is always a good idea just to find issues with it. And sometimes hiring a copy editor to do this is worth its weight in gold because they're going to be able to do this and they do it professionally for a living. And so you're going to be paying somebody to do the copy editing and proofreading and maybe even line editing if you want to go that route. In any case, now that we talked about the kinds of editing, I'm going to transition and talk about some of the tools that I use and the process that I just described to you. So I pulled this excerpt out of the third chapter of my upcoming novel, Legacy of the Legend. Now, this is from a document that I had before I started editing it and doing a lot of the line edits, copy edits, and proofreading on it. So this is in its pretty much raw form after I did a lot of that developmental editing and a lot of that more content editing. This is focusing on the proofreading aspects of it. So I'm not going to be really talking about editing the document for structure and substance as much as I'm going to be talking about just doing a lot of those mechanical type edits that you do down in the weeds in the document. The first thing I like to do whenever I'm doing my edits is listen to my work being read aloud. Now you can use a tool to do this, and that's what a way I like to do it, or you can read it aloud yourself. So to do this in Microsoft Word, it's really pretty easy to do. You come over here to this menu and you can toggle on read aloud. If you already have it turned on, it will be an A up there. If you don't, you just select this and pick read aloud and you'll get this A with sound waves coming off of it. When you turn that on and you click on it, you'll put the buttons over here to control it on the top right side of the document. And from here, you can then adjust the settings. Now you have three voices. You have David, who's more of a bass, Zyra, who's more of an alto, and Mark's a tenor. I'd like to listen to Mark. And then I'm going to put the cursor where we want to start from. And this is probably it's going to sound like something like this.
Vinek lay under the open sky, unable to see the moon or stars for clouds that overcast the plain. The light wind rustled the grass about him, but the wind blew warm and moist from the south. Rain started with large drops that were sporadic, but their numbers increased, and the rain soaked him to the bone and the surrounding alpacas.
So once you're started hearing it being read aloud, you can adjust the speed. So if you like to go faster, you can go faster, or you can go slower if you like to have a slower voice. I'm going to slow it down a little bit.
2. They hunkered in the rain as he did, doing their best to tolerate the drops that pelted them from above.
That's a little bit too slow for my liking, so I'm going to go ahead and speed it back up to something that is more in the middle of what I had at the beginning and something that I have now.
The rain stopped, and Vinek stood up and tried his best to brush himself off. But nothing was dry. He was wet. The alpacas were wet. Everything was wet.
So you get the point there. It's pretty straightforward. It's not hard to use, and it will allow you to pick up on a lot of the nuances of the text, and you can proofread it using this method. Now, another tool that I like to use for doing a lot of line editing, copy editing, and proofreading is Grammarly. Grammarly is a really nice tool that integrates with Microsoft Word. And you can click on this. There's a free level of this available, so it'll give you some of the basic stuff, but the more advanced tool, the one that you pay for, has a lot more features, and it'll detect a lot of different things. So as I'm reading this will show me a lot of different things right here. It's going to give me suggestions. That doesn't mean that you have to follow them. So it's suggesting that I need an article. I can say the rain or rain. That's fine. I can ignore that one. And this one needs a dash between those two. Rain soaked. That would be a good added there. Large is a weaker adjective. It's saying, suggesting that maybe I should use enormous. Enormous is probably okay. That's a little bit over the top for that. So I'm going to ignore that one. Large is probably fine for that. Now, this one, it's suggesting that I have a monotonous passage right here. And this is more of the line edits. It sees that I have 4 very short sentences here. Now, I did this for effect. Just having 3 short sentences like that just helps, resolve a lot of these more longer sentences that have come before it. Everything was wet, he was wet, everything was wet. And then I come into a longer sentence after that. So that's one of those judgment calls. Now, if that was 3 or 4 sentences where I wasn't trying to use it for effect, I would probably ignore it. So that's something I can choose to ignore. It's going to give you a lot of things like that. And there is a lot of other things that this thing will pick up on. I've only just given you a sampling of what it can do. So it's a really nice tool. I use it not just for writing fiction, but for essays, short stories, and a lot of the professional writing that I use as well. Another tool that I like to use is ProWritingAid. Now, this is another tool that's similar to Grammarly, but it's got some features that Grammarly doesn't have that I think help with a lot of the kinds of things that I have struggles with, which are crutch words and monotony and things like that. It's got some statistical analysis that you can apply to it. It also has a rules engine that it will look for the same kinds of things Grammarly does. I think Grammarly is good for some things. I think this tool is good for some things. I'm going to do a more in-depth review of these in the future, but in any case, I use this one because I think it's got some features that really just help tighten up your writing. So I'm going to come over here and paste it in this document. Now, this particular one right here does a pretty good job of doing a statistical analysis for the entire text that you're pasting into it or you're editing at the time. And that's one thing I like about this one, is it kind of looks at the whole thing more as a whole versus looking at it at the line edits. So it's able to detect a lot of different kinds of problems that you might have with repeated words or overused words or underused words and things like that. So with this, a couple of the tools that I like to use is first is to click on this grammar tool. And this is similar to what Grammarly does. It's going to show me a couple of the issues that I have. It's going to say, what do I need to do here? And you can skip over here to this particular one right here. And it's going to say what's going on here. It says missing a comma. And you may or may not need that. I mean, that's one of those, because I have a comma right here. May or may not need that comma, but that's kind of discretionary there. And this one is saying a distance. That's probably a comma splice. That's a good call there. And this one right here, this one probably needs probably doesn't need a comma there, but it's suggesting one. So I'm going to ignore that. So that's one thing I like about this. Another thing you can check here is style. The style is not so much about grammar, but this is kind of getting down into some line edits using or copy editing and line edits that you can kind of look for overused words or too many adverbs, words that end with ly and that kind of thing. And so it's found some passive voice here. Passive voice is something that he has that you generally want to avoid. In this, over the places where the grass have been chewed, or I could probably just say chewed grass here. And that would be a nice edit for that right there. Overused is going to show you a lot of crutch words. Now this one shows me that I have was or were past tense verbs there, past tense being verbs. And that's one of those things that you could probably clean up a lot here. It says I'm using that a lot, and I'm using look quite a bit. But my crutch word is went, and if pretty much everything that I write will have went as one of those that it shows up a lot. So I will go through the document and clean that up some. I could a couple of different things related to dialogue. There's no dialogue in this, but it'll show you kind of your a ratio of dialogue tags to dialogue, and then your dialogue to non-dialogue. And so you kind of want to minimize your dialogue tags. And so if you have too many of them, you can go through your document and kind of weed some of that out, just tighten it up a good bit. And you can use the sensory one. I don't use it as much, but it does allow you to see a sense of what you're explaining in your text. And when with fantasy or any kind of novels or any kind of fiction, the better use of the five senses that you have, the better off your writing will be. And so I've got a smattering of sight, touch, sound, smell, and taste, which is good. You kind of want to have all five senses engaged in the work. And that's generally something that you kind of want to work towards. And this one happens to have that in such a short text, which is actually kind of nice there. So once I'm done running it through software, I typically like to read it through a few more times just to make sure that I'm satisfied with the way it reads at that point, because sometimes the software can make edits, but it affects the readability of the document. So you want to make sure that it still reads smoothly, that it flows well. And so you want to go back and just do more line editing, more copy editing, more proofreading, doing that. Now, once I'm done with that, that's when I'm ready usually to send it off to my beta readers. Now I've got some great beta readers that will pick up a lot on the mistakes that I miss. Inevitably, I'm going to miss a bunch. And so they'll send me back my document with edits and comments saying, hey, you might want to check this, you might want to check that, add this, remove this. And then of course, they're going to make comments about the substance that I'll go back and add into my substance editing and some of my structural editing at that point. So I'm going to do even more editing at that point. After I get it back from my beta readers and I've done all of that editing, and I will go back and read it a few more times just to make sure that I'm satisfied with it with those edits. And once I get it to that point, then I will typically say, hey, it's ready for publishing. So having done all this editing, I would still say sometimes it's appropriate to hire a copy editor or to get somebody that's going to be a professional to look at your work, especially if you're kind of starting out. And that's one mistake I made as a writer whenever I started writing my first novel. I did a lot of the editing myself, but inevitably I didn't do enough editing. And so what I ended up publishing was not the best work I could have done. And I should have spent a lot more time editing. A lot of this me learning by trial, me learning by my mistakes. So in the future, if I get more successful as a writer, maybe I'll hire copy editors and I'll hire proofreaders to do a lot more of that, more mechanical editing, and focus more on the other kinds of edits myself. But right now, this is the process I use for that. And hopefully it's going to be useful for you if you want to apply this same methodology to your work. And hopefully it'll give you some hints and tips and tricks for editing your books in the future.